Friends, this morning as we continue our sermon series called Bad Boys and Girls of the Bible, our bad boy for the week is Lot, who is Abram's nephew. And his story really does read a bit like a tragic novel. We first hear about Lot in Genesis 11, where we learn that he was a descendant of Noah's son Shem. Lot's father was named Haran, and his grandfather was named Terah, and Abraham, whose name was actually Abram at the time, was Haran's brother, and so therefore he was Lot's uncle. Confused? Yeah, don't worry, it gets worse. All right. When Lot's father, Haran, died, his grandfather, Terah, took Lot away from his mother, as was apparently the custom of the day. Then Terah took Abram and Abram's wife, Sarai, his grandson Lot, and all of their possessions away from their home in the city of Ur to a village called Haran, several hundred miles inland and upriver. That is where Terah died at the age of 205. Lot was taken in by his uncle Abram, who was, as was also the custom of the day. They traveled together as a family, first to Canaan and then to Egypt, where they were eventually expelled by Pharaoh. And that is where we pick up the story from Genesis 13, which I'm about to read to you today. So, chapter 13 of the book of Genesis. Abram went up from Egypt toward the arid southern plain with his wife, with everything he had, and with Lot. Abram was very wealthy in livestock, silver, and gold. Abram traveled, making and breaking camp from the arid southern plain to Bethel and to the sacred place there, where he first pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. That is, to the place at which he had earlier built the altar. There he worshiped the Lord's name. Now Lot, who traveled with Abram, also had flocks, cattle, and tents. They had so many possessions between them that the land could not support both of them. They could no longer live together. Conflicts broke out between those herding Abram's livestock and those herding Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have disputes between you and me, and between our herders, since we are relatives. Isn't the whole land in front of you? Let's separate. If you go north, I will go south, and if you go south, I will go north." Lot looked up and saw the entire Jordan Valley. All of it was well irrigated, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as far as Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the entire Jordan Valley. Lot set out toward the east, and they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot settled near the cities of the valley and pitched his tent close to Sodom. The citizens of Sodom were very evil and sinful against the Lord. After Lot separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, "From the place where you are standing, look up and gaze to the north, south, east, and west. Because all the land that you see, I give you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth. If someone could count the bits of dust on the earth, then they could also count your descendants. Stand up and walk around through the length and breadth of the land, because I am giving it to you." So Abram packed his tent and went and settled by the oaks of Mamre in Hebron. There he built an altar to the Lord. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. You know, as biblical characters go, we don't generally hear a lot about Lot. In fact, his story is so embedded in the story of Abraham and Sarah that too often Lot is overlooked When we do hear about him, it's usually in relationship to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And for many of us, Lot's wife is the more memorable of the two characters, even though she really only gets an honorable mention. But Lot's story is important because as a bad boy of questionable virtue, he teaches us that when we make choices on our own, without considering God's desire for our lives, very often those choices result in undesirable consequences that could have been avoided. So let's take a closer look at Lot and his life. For all intents and purposes, we could say that Lot's life involved one tragedy after another, starting with the death of his father Haran. Although the text isn't really clear, it does appear that after his father's death, Lot was taken away from his mother by his grandfather Terah, who then took him along with his uncle Abram and Aunt Sarai from their home in Ur on a journey toward Canaan. But the family only made it as far as the village of Haran, where they settled until Terah died at the ripe old age of 205. This meant that Lot was once again an orphan. But as familial custom dictated, he was taken in by his uncle Abram, who became Lot's legal father, which in ancient Near Eastern terms meant that Abram had authority over Lot. So even though by that time Lot was undoubtedly an adult with a family of his own, he was still under Abram's control. So when Abram moved his family to the land of Canaan, Lot went with him. And when Abram decided they would be better off in Egypt, Lot and his family had no choice but to tag along, taking their possessions, their livestock, their slaves, everything along with. Because even though Lot was by then a wealthy man who owned an assortment of flocks, cattle, and tents, and even though he had already inherited his father's portion of his grandfather's estate, and even though as Abram's only male heir at the time, he stood to inherit Abram's part of his grandfather's inheritance as well upon his death, until all of that happened, Lot was under Abram's control, which, as it turned out, wasn't necessarily a good thing. Because during his lifetime, Abram's behavior was also less than stellar. And some of his choices were questionable at best. Some of you will recall from the story in Genesis 12, when the family moved to Egypt, Abram convinced his wife Sarai to pretend to be his sister in order to save his own skin, even though that decision put her in jeopardy. Then later in Genesis 20, wouldn't you know, he did it again. Only this time when they went to Gerar. And when Sarai demanded Abram take her servant Hagar as his wife, Abram stood idly by when Sarai abused Hagar, even though Hagar was the mother of his firstborn son. Needless to say, Abram wasn't a great role model for Lot. And unfortunately, it seems his ability to make bad choices did rub off on Lot as well. Lot's first bad choice comes near the beginning of chapter 13. Since both he and Abram had so much stuff that the land on which they settled between Bethel and Ai wasn't big enough for the both of them, Abram suggests that they split up. Now, being the elder between the two, it was the custom that Abram would defer to his nephew, saying, "Wherever you go, I will go in the opposite direction." But what the text doesn't tell us is that according to the ancient Near Eastern customs, it was customary for the elder to make such an offer, but it was also customary for the younger to toss that offer back to the elder. In other words, what Lot should have said was, "Oh no, Uncle Abe, I owe you a debt of gratitude. You took me in when my father and grandfather died. You treated me like your own son, and because you, I am a wealthy man. Since you have been so gracious to me, I insist that you choose first, and I will take what is left." Kind of like the big cupcake, little cupcake, right? Well, that's what Lot should have done, but he didn't. Instead of letting Abram choose where he and his family would settle, the scripture tells us in Genesis 13, verses 10 through 12, that Lot looked up and saw the entire Jordan Valley. All of it was well irrigated, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as far as Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the entire Jordan Valley. Lot set out toward the east, and they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot settled near the cities of the valley and pitched his tent close to Sodom. Now that was Lot's second bad choice. He chose what he believed to be the easier life, where he wouldn't have to worry, but instead could just sit back and be happy. He chose the land that was fertile and green instead of choosing the desert that would have been much harder to work. Now, I think that maybe Lot was accustomed to living the good life. After all, the city of Ur in those days, where he grew up at that time, was a bustling metropolis. In fact, it was second only to the civilization of Egypt. So given the choice, and he was, Lot preferred living in a place that was easy, a place that he thought would be a blessing, not a curse. So he pitched his tent close to Sodom because, after all, I think he was probably a bit of a city boy himself. Which then led to Lot's third bad choice. If we were to continue reading into chapter 14, we would hear that after Lot became a prisoner of war and was rescued by his uncle Abe, he presumably settled in Sodom, since that was where he was living the next time we encounter him in Genesis 19. Now, we have no idea why he chose to settle in Sodom. After all, as we read in chapter 13, Sodom was full of evil people. But we do know that Lot's choice to settle there led to consequences, mostly bad ones, that affected the rest of his life. When we jump over to chapter 19, we see Lot trying to do the right thing, but unfortunately, he was failing miserably. He tries to extend hospitality to two strangers who turn out to be angels of the Lord as they enter Sodom's city gate. But when his home is surrounded by an angry mob of men who were intent upon raping the strangers, Lot offers his daughters to the mob instead, saying, "Do with them whatever you wish." Now, folks, to our modern sensibilities, this sounds like an awful thing for Lot to do. Why would any father choose to offer up his own virgin daughters to be raped by a mob? It doesn't make sense. But that's what Scripture tells us that he did. And when the mob refused to take his daughters, then they went after him. But the angels saved Lot, and then they urge him to leave Sodom before the city is destroyed by the Lord. Now, Lot hesitates, maybe because he didn't want to leave his new home behind. I don't know. So the angels physically remove him and his wife and his two unmarried daughters, and they are physically removed by the angels who came to see him in the first place. And when we get to the end of chapter 19, we find that Lot is destitute. He has lost everything. His home, his livestock, all of his possessions. His wife, who we will talk about in 2 weeks, has turned into a pillar of salt. And the last we hear of Lot is that he is living in a cave in the mountains near Zoar with his 2 young daughters who actually end up making some bad choices of their own. Instead of living a don't worry, be happy life, Lot's legacy was and still is as a very, very bad boy. But what if he had chosen a different path? What if instead of making that first bad choice, he instead chose to stay with Abram and his family? What if he had said to his Uncle Abe, "Thank you, Uncle, for allowing me to choose, but I would rather be with you. I would rather give away some or all of my stuff if it meant that we could stay together as a family. So let's put our heads together and figure out how we can share the land together. Because, family is more important. And I think God's desire for us as a family is more important than anything else. What if, rather than doing things his way, Lot chose instead a better way, God's way? As I mentioned to the children, every day we make choices, and there are a lot of different ways that we can make those choices. And I wanted to share with you a little video that I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but it really kind of demonstrates to me the idea of different ways that we can make choices. See if I can get these lights off.
I finally figured out what car to get. Now, where to find the best deal?
Why don't I help?
What's that?
CarGurus. Color?
Silver. CarGurus?
Low miles, 2 grand below market value, 5-star dealer rating. Ooh, I'm beat.
Let's do it your way, then.
I heard that.
CarGurus. Find great deals from top-rated dealers near you at CarGurus.com.
That commercial makes me laugh every time. But it does demonstrate a different way, that we have different ways in which we can, oops, did I do those lights wrong? That's all right. That we can make different choices in our lives. And sometimes making choices is easy. And other times making choices is really hard. And sometimes the choices that we have to make are easy, and other times they are really, really difficult to do. And it is during those times when we are dealing with difficult choices that we may just want to choose God's way instead of our own as we work toward making those choices. Because after all, God's way is the better way, isn't it? So how do we make godly choices? Well, Reverend David Owens offers 4 principles that can help us make choices that are more in line with God's desire for our lives. First, he says, don't be blinded by potential positive benefits. He writes, the positive is usually obvious and can be grasped immediately, but it can also blind us to anything else if we aren't careful. As humans, we are easily lured to that which is shiny or pleasing. He goes on to say, consider the mousetrap. Of course, the cheese looks tasty, but we must not let it blind us to the trap into which it has been set. Second, he says that we must not underestimate the impact of bad consequences, what the impact would be on our lives. If we think about some of the bad decisions that we've made in the past, how often were the benefits not as good as we expected, and the drawbacks even worse than we anticipated? It's easy to downplay the negative when we're enamored by the positive. Lot, in our story, saw the green valley and saw that it was beautiful. And even though he knew that Sodom was evil, he downplayed its impact on his family. Third, we must seek advice from the Lord and from other godly people in our lives. How many times do we read in the Bible of the people in the Bible that they get into trouble when they didn't ask God or other godly people for advice? And quite frankly, why do you think that we skip this step? I know, because we really don't want to know the answer, right? Fourth, we have to ask ourselves a very important question. Will this choice that I'm about to make enhance my relationship with God? Because if our choices compromise our walk with God, then they're probably not good choices. Because there's really something more important than making more money or advancing our careers or finding new romance or attending a better school. And that something is our relationship with God. Nothing else matters more. And if our choices are going to pull us away from that relationship and keep us disconnected from God, then they're not good choices. One Monday, after a tough loss the Saturday before, the University of Alabama coach Bear Bryant went to a barbershop to get a haircut. After a few moments of silence, the barber who was cutting his hair said, "You know, Coach, I don't believe I would have put that young quarterback in the game just because the starter wasn't doing so well. The turnovers he made cost us the game." To which Coach Bryant nodded his head and he said, "Well, you know, if I'd have had until Monday to decide, I don't think I would have put him in either." You know, as the old saying goes, hindsight is 20/20. In hindsight, maybe Lot would have chosen to pitch his tent someplace else. Or maybe he would have chosen to stay with Abram instead of going his own way. In fact, maybe a lot of the bad choices he made would have been different if he had had the benefit of hindsight. But my friends, foresight is much better than hindsight. And when we follow the principles that were offered by Reverend David Owens before we make our choices, we are much more likely to choose the way that's in line with God's desires for our lives. Because true happiness comes when our choices mirror God's desire for us and when we follow God's way instead of our own. And if you're interested, I will put in an article in next week's newsletter those 4 principles that we should use when we're making choices. Amen? Amen.